Dr. Lugovskyy, it's great to see you today.
Very nice seeing you, Jason, as well.
So, Professor, you're the chair of the Department of Economics at Indiana University, and you follow what's going on in Russia. Now, economically, a lot of people are saying that the Russian economy is on thin ice. At any point, it could collapse. But when you listen to Russian leaders, they say it's not so bad. There's some little problems here and there, but it's manageable. How bad is the situation really with the Russian economy?
So thank you for your question. Yes, I'm interested in what's going on in Russian economy for many reasons. And obviously, like Russian government is part of Russian propaganda. So they'll keep saying that everything is great, doesn't matter what, right? So recently Putin has mentioned that inflation is only 4%, but salaries have increased even by higher rates, so it's all great, right? So if it were so great, then there are these fundamental parts of Russian statistics which do not match with that. And so one of those would be population, right? And so population has decreased by almost 2 million in the last 4 years, right? So if economy is doing great, if everything is so great, so how come you're losing over 1% of your population in 4 years, right? And so that's by Russian official statistics, right? So I'd say that might be even bigger than that because they obviously have incentives to decrease it, but they cannot completely put their foolish numbers because this is something which does not depend on the opinion. This is just counting people, right? So another interesting part which would be kind of paying attention to is the key central bank's interest rate is 21%, right? So what it means if inflation were indeed 4%, as Putin said, or actually what he said was contrary to what Russian official statistics is reporting because they just upgraded their official inflation rate from 8% to 10%. Let's say even if it were at 10%, it means that you can make profit of 11% by doing nothing, just by keeping money in Russian banks, right? So very good profit margin. So somehow you don't see everybody rushing to put their money in Russian banks, right? So this means that A, inflation obviously is not right. B, the default risks are very high, right? So what else we see? We see that now you start seeing big contradictions among Russian officials, right? So you have the head of the central bank, Naibulina. So she's acknowledging that the economic situation is difficult and that she's increasing the Russian central bank interest rate in order to keep inflation under control. It would have been even higher if she didn't do that, right? And then you have all people who are trying to maintain some kind of business, including the head of Russian defense sector, who openly criticizes her. His name is Chemezov, Sergei Chemezov. And you also now have a fraction in Russia's parliament, Duma, who openly ask to remove Naibulina from her position. And some people even ask to replace her, not just to replace her, but also to imprison her, right? So, I should say that to her credit, she is indeed doing a lot to keep the inflation under control. And so if this other party prevails, which they may, and so Putin may just at some point start saying, oh, look, it was all central bank's fault, so we just replace the leadership and everything will be great again, right? So if she were to be replaced, then the next person, even if they were as smart as she is, would know that that might happen to them as well, and they would follow all these populist measures, and they would do whatever populists would tell them, and so then the inflation will accelerate, and so the economy will collapse even sooner than now, right? So you have all these reports about mortgages rates. You have reports about Russia not having money to pay even to its police force, and people are massively leaving police force, right? So you have all kinds of signs that things are not going as normal. And so, in fact, you start seeing tendencies that Russian economy moves away from market economy regulation, which despite all this post-Soviet type of mentality, the Russian government tries to enforce because it's a more efficient system. And they're trying now to replace it with a centralized system, whereas everything will be prescribed from the top, who should produce what and which quantities, right? And especially with an emphasis on the military sector, where already prices are not market prices. And So it's already kind of this post-Soviet style of producing military equipment, ammunition, and all that. So if that's going to happen, right? So it does have some advantages, especially during the time of war. But the biggest disadvantage is that this centralized economy is not suited well to maintain production of technological, of complex goods. Because for those goods, you need to have cooperation and you have to have contracts and incentives for multiple companies to work together, right? So in the modern world, you cannot have just one big firm which produces everything from A to Z. You need a cooperation of multiple firms. If you remove the market economy out of that and you're trying to regulate it all by hand, so that's where things going to collapse, because it's impossible for just one person or even one team to regulate this mechanism efficiently. And so this will be everything which we've seen during the Soviet Union, right? So there will be those who are trying to stay as close as possible to the government, to people in power, and they'll do anything to survive in those positions, whether those orders are okay or not, whether the economy is efficient or not, right? And so that's similar to what we've seen, let's say, during Stalin's time, where the only way to survive is A, to support your government 120%, and two, to do exactly as you told, no questions asked, right? So which leads to inefficiency and which leads to these orders being fulfilled, whether they're good or not.
So that's a fascinating situation. The central bank is aware that inflation is quite high. It's not the 9% that they officially say, but it could be much higher. In fact, some economists have said that it could be as high as 27 or 28%. Now, at the same time, Russia is facing devaluation of the ruble when oil prices drop, as they're expected to do in the next few months. But overall, let's imagine that happens. Let's imagine the Russian members of parliament are successful in getting the head of the central bank fired. And instead of increasing interest rates, which would help control inflation, they decide to just drop the interest rates to a very low number and to give out even more loans to people. What sort of impact will that have on the Russian economy?
Okay, so already now, right? So Russia, of course, makes those claims that their GDP is around growing around 4% per year in the last year, right? So which is definitely not true. And so, in fact, there is this report by Swedish economists backed by Swedish government, and that predicts that Russian GDP has decreased at least by 11%, right? So 10 to 11%. And so now if the price of oil were to drop, that's going to be a huge blow to Russian economy. Doesn't matter what they do. Even if they have, the smartest people in central bank and government and everywhere else, right? So if they want to continue the war, if they want to continue funding all these operations abroad, which they do, right? So that's not going to be sustainable, because these days, oil is the major source of revenue for Russian economy, right? And we already see Russia losing its influence abroad, right? So we can see this dramatic fall of Syria, and Syria was a strategic component of Russian doctrine, and losing Syria did not come easy as a political decision. It's just they didn't have choice. They had to choose between Ukraine and Syria, and they decided to give up on Syria and maintain Ukraine. So they may further lose their allies in Europe, right? And especially with the blocking of Russian gas going to Slovakia, right? And overall lesser funding in other countries. So we see that even parties which are supported by Russian money abroad start declaring that Putin is a war criminal and all that, right? So that, to me, says it just basically they are losing funding. And as soon as they lose funding, those components, they don't have that ideological part, so they will not support Putin for nothing, right? So they want funding. So even if everything were great in terms of efficiency of Russian government, in terms of how smart people are controlling that, right? So the blow of lower oil price for Russia will be huge. But I think when things will worsen for Russia, right? So then there will be this game of trying to blame somebody, and then there will be also a game to appease the population to make those populist claims. And so they will probably try to make all these like radical shifts and replace some key people in the government and blame everything on them, maybe even imprison some people, right? So as they did with several managers and several key military generals in the past, right? And so that's going to just accelerate even more the downfall of Russian economy.
So you recall just a couple of weeks ago, the Russian ruble lost more than 10% of its value against the dollar just in a few hours. And the same thing happened just a week later. In both cases, the ruble did recover and go down to less than 100 to dollar. But what does that tell us about the Russian ruble itself? How stable is it? How strong is it? Or how destabilized is it?
So for any, let's say, major market economy, right? So a blow of exchange rate falling down by 10% within hours would be a very serious blow, right? And then what happens in case of Russia? So the cause which kind of put this downward pressure on ruble was not even that fundamental. So it just was sanctions against Gazprom Bank. So one of the major now banks in Russia, which facilitates transactions in Russia. And so blocking just one bank caused all that. And of course, there might have been idea that signal for wider sanctions. And so over time, they restored, right? So they managed to find another way how to facilitate those transactions. But so it shows that everything is subject to just relatively small shocks, which can collapse the Russian economy, right? And so there are debates about the effectiveness of sanctions, and it should be added that sanctions are not imposed on Russia by the entire world, right? So they have their allies, they have countries which facilitate the survival of Russia, they have countries which are either direct allies or they just don't care and they utilize the moment to buy oil and Russian energy at lower prices, right? But so as soon as you kind of tighten the sanctions and you impose sanctions in a way that those economies wouldn't be able to pay Russia in hard currency or in some other meaningful way of payment for their energy, right? So Russia is going to collapse. So Russia is in an extremely vulnerable position. It voluntarily gave up European market, right? So and then it now acts with players who are potentially less reliable. And on the top of that, there are sanctions which threaten Russia now and then, and they threaten also the way Russia gets money from those revenues. And so that's why ruble, despite its political value for Putin, despite the fact that that's like number one priority for Putin to, on the economic front at least, right? So to maintain this exchange rate around 100. So even in those cases, you see how shaky, how unstable it is.
So it seems like a very tough situation for Russia. So let me ask you two last questions. First, if the US were to put in a whole new line of sanctions, as some anticipate happening soon before Biden leaves the White House, the sanctions would be targeted specifically at Russia's oil industry and would also target the ghost fleets that Russia has operating around the world, illegally transporting oil for Russia. Now, if that were to happen, what impact would that have on the Russian economy?
So if sanctions were indeed as strict as you're saying and would be able to block Russian shadow fleet, so I think this will be a very heavy blow to Russian oil revenues, right? Because they greatly rely on that to deliver oil in various like parts of the world. And so blocking that would cut off the pipeline, would basically limit their ability to get money from all these countries. And there is, like, given that this is not the first round of sanctions, right? So we don't know, they would be obviously finding the way to counteract it and try to do something else. So it depends on political will of the United States and also its allies to enforce those sanctions, and also on the ability to block further attempts to counteract those sanctions by Russia. But if those attempts were successful, that would be the first order effect. And that would be a very serious blow economically. And immediately, because Russia depends on money now to hire not just, like all kinds of goods, but even to hire people to fight for it, right? So it would also immediately block Russia's ability also as geopolitical player worldwide, and also specifically on the Ukrainian front.
So looking ahead, what is it that Russia should be doing that they're not doing that would be able to fix their economy? And how bad could it really get? Do you really think this could be as bad as the 1998 collapse of the ruble?
That's a good question. And so the difference between 1998 and now is that in 1998, kind of the Western world was more or less on Russia's side, right? So they were like potentially bailing it out, and so overall economic activity was still there, and there was cooperation between Russia and the West. So now it's different, right? So this channel will be off. I don't think China, I don't think Iran will be trying to buy Russia out, right? And so, and Russia understand that. Russia understand that. And if you see now, so Russia always like saying, we may negotiate, we may not negotiate, but they keep repeating that, we don't want sanctions. So sanctions have to be removed immediately, right? So despite their previous claims that they are not hurt by sanctions, all of a sudden, even Putin himself brings up the question of sanctions as something which needs to be immediately removed, right? And so Russia is desperate to restore its economic activity and to cooperate with the West, because otherwise they see that their economy is going down, right? And so I think they're trying to play that, and I think they're trying to negotiate maybe that basically to get some ability to earn money. And I think they're also afraid of potential decrease in the oil prices, as we discussed before, right? So which people expect to happen within the next few months, right? And so that's what Russia should be doing immediately, is basically trying to get something which would allow it to still make money despite low oil prices and despite tightened sanctions, right? And so that's what they're trying to do. I don't think at the moment they're successful, and I really hope they will not be successful, but that's basically their course of actions.
So actually, let me ask you just one last question you've provoked. So let's imagine that. Let's imagine that tomorrow the sanctions were taken off of Russia. Would everything just snap back to normal? Would everything just be fine, like nothing happened? Or would it be a process? I mean, a long process. And alternatively, let's imagine this. Let's imagine tomorrow Russia decided to end the war and just go home. Now, what would that mean for the Russian economy if there's no longer a necessity for massive military spendings?
Okay, so if sanctions were to be removed, but Russia were allowed to wage its war in Ukraine, right? So obviously their position would become much stronger, because they can then finance the war more effectively. They can buy supplies from abroad. They can also recruit people from abroad. They can do all kinds of things. So that potentially would be the worst scenario for Ukraine. If the war were to be stopped, right, and so Russia were not allowed to continue the war, and in return they would be allowed to trade, and they would be allowed to be paid for their oil. So obviously that would be an improvement for Russian economy, because they don't need to finance the defense sector, they don't need to finance army, and so they can redirect money towards like more productive economic activity. It will take time, right? So because so many links have been destroyed, and so the trust has been destroyed as well, right? So even if you have, let's say, selfish Western investors who say, oh, you know what, that's a good opportunity, that's how I can make a lot of money, because there is not that much competition, I'll just go to Russia and start business as usual, right? So even these guys, I think, will be very cautious, because they understand that any moment it can be destroyed, and their property will be seized, and their investments will be taken away, right? So the trust which is no longer there is very difficult to restore. It will take a lot of time, and actually I don't think it can be restored unless you see major political changes in Russia. So even in that case, which potentially would be the best for Russian economy, I think there would be no foreign investments in Russian economy. There will be obviously better possibility to import goods and to export Russian energy, but those would be fairly minor compared to the possibility of getting Western technology and Western investments.
So let's hope that, in fact, the sanctions continue to increase against Russia and that the Russian economy finally collapses. Professor, great speaking with you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jason. It was very nice talking to you as well. Thanks.